I never expected it to go on.
Don Knotts was the man who made millions laugh. But after he passed away, his family uncovered things inside his home that no one could have predicted. Hidden letters, sealed drawers, and personal writings revealed a side of Don the world had never seen. What they found did not just surprise his fans, it left even his closest loved ones in disbelief. This is not the story Hollywood told you. Don Knotts was not just funny, he was unforgettable. For millions of Americans, his name brings back a flood of memories. The wide-eyed expressions, the nervous stammer, and that high-pitched voice always teetering on the edge of a meltdown. Whether he was bumbling through scenes as Deputy Barney Fife on The Andy Griffith Show or bringing awkward charm to Three's Company, Don was the embodiment of harmless, lovable comedy. To most, he was pure joy in a bow tie. But behind that iconic grin was a man few people really knew. Viewers assumed he must be just like his characters, silly, gentle, simple. The truth was far more complicated. Don spent his career perfecting an image that was light, approachable, and spotless. And for a long time, no one questioned it. Why would they? He stayed out of trouble, avoided controversy, and kept his name far from the tabloids. His life, at least from the outside, seemed too clean to dig into. And yet, when Don Knotts passed away in 2006, another story began to surface. It started with whispers, rumors from people close to him that his final years held secrets. Then came his daughter's memoir, cracking open the carefully sealed version of his life that he had guarded for decades. And finally, as his family sorted through his belongings, they discovered just how much he had kept hidden. Locked drawers, unfinished scripts, old letters, personal items that told a very different story. This was not just the passing of a beloved actor, it was the unraveling of a myth. For years, the man who made everyone laugh had been quietly carrying the weight of old trauma, self-doubt, and buried emotions. What he left behind was not just memorabilia, it was a window into a complicated soul who spent a lifetime smiling through the pain. So if his legacy was carefully constructed, what was he trying to protect? The answers would begin to appear in the unlikeliest of places: dusty drawers, sealed boxes, and the words of people who had stayed silent for years. And it all traces back to a childhood that most fans never even knew existed. Long before Don Knotts became a national treasure, his world was anything but joyful. Born in 1924 in Morgantown, West Virginia, he grew up in a home filled with silence, fear, and emotional instability. From the outside, the Knotts family looked like any hardworking American household, but inside their modest house, a much darker reality unfolded, one that would leave permanent marks on Don's mind. His father, William Knotts, suffered a mental breakdown after Don's birth. Likely battling what we would now call schizophrenia, he fell into delusions and unpredictable rages. In one terrifying moment, he reportedly held a knife to young Don's throat. That night became more than a memory. It became a wound that never fully healed. By his teenage years, Don's father had passed away, but the damage was already done. Don grew up shy, anxious, and withdrawn, often retreating into imaginary worlds. He created characters and voices, not for entertainment, but as a way to survive. His mother, Elsie, managed a boarding house to keep the family afloat, and Don had to share space with strangers. Privacy was scarce, safety even scarcer. He found escape in humor, telling jokes, imitating voices. Making people laugh gave him power in a world that often made him feel invisible. But behind every laugh was a boy still haunted by fear. As he grew older, he developed what he later called a nervous condition, a quiet anxiety that never quite let go. Even at his most confident, there was always a flicker of unease in his eyes. Most fans thought it was part of the act, but those closest to him knew better. Don learned early that laughter could be a shield, and he would carry that shield into every stage, every set, every public appearance for the rest of his life. But with fame came new pressure, not just to be funny, but to stay hidden. Because what he brought with him into adulthood was more than a talent for comedy. It was a deep, relentless fear that would follow him straight into Hollywood. To the world, Don Knotts was a comedic genius, an Emmy-winning actor whose timing was flawless and whose every nervous twitch could make an entire room burst into laughter. But behind the scenes, the very things that made him so funny were rooted in something far more personal: fear. Don's insecurities were not just emotional, they were all-encompassing. From the earliest days of his career, he battled a deep fear of rejection and failure. Even as he was winning awards and being celebrated on national television, he could not silence the nagging belief that he was not good enough, not smart enough, not handsome enough, not talented enough. He once admitted in an interview that every time a show ended or a role wrapped, he believed it might be the last time anyone would hire him. He was known to obsess over his performances, rewatching scenes repeatedly, picking apart every detail of his facial expressions and line delivery. While his roles came across as effortless on screen, each one was the result of intense personal pressure. Don did not just want to get it right, he needed to, because in his mind, if he slipped, it would all come crashing down. Even in his personal life, that fear never left him. Don was married 3 times, and while he was known as a kind and thoughtful partner, close friends said he often struggled with emotional intimacy. He had difficulty trusting that people truly cared about him outside of his fame. He would often distance himself emotionally, even from those who loved him most. For someone who spent his life making others laugh, Don carried an enormous weight of sadness that few ever saw. As he aged, the anxiety worsened. He worried about fading into obscurity, about becoming irrelevant in an industry obsessed with youth and looks. When he joined Three's Company in the late 1970s, it was not just another gig, it was a lifeline. He had feared that his career had already peaked after The Andy Griffith Show. The success of his character, Mr. Furley, brought him back into the spotlight, but it also reignited the fear of being overshadowed or replaced once again. What no one realized at the time was that Don had a very private space in his home, a quiet, dimly lit study where he kept journals, sketches, and personal notes that he never shared with anyone. Inside that room, the man who spent his life portraying lovable fools wrote out his fears in sharp, unfiltered detail. These writings were not comedic, they were raw, revealing glimpses of a man who never stopped doubting himself, no matter how loud the applause was. And yet, perhaps the most telling part of his emotional battle came from one relationship that shaped him more than any other. It was the professional friendship that started strong but eventually unraveled behind the scenes, and it left wounds Don never fully healed from. Because when things soured between Don Knotts and Andy Griffith, it was not just about a television show, it was personal. To most fans, the friendship between Don Knotts and Andy Griffith seemed rare, genuine, supportive, and lasting. On The Andy Griffith Show, their chemistry was electric. Don's jittery, rule-obsessed Deputy Barney Fife perfectly contrasted Andy's calm and confident sheriff. Their dynamic became one of television's most beloved duos, and for a time, their off-screen friendship mirrored that same magic. But fame changes people, and time reveals what scripts cannot. Don and Andy began with mutual admiration. Don credited Andy for giving him the freedom to shine, while Andy publicly praised Don's comedic brilliance. Yet beneath the surface, tension quietly brewed. When Don announced he was leaving the show after 5 seasons, fans were stunned. Behind the scenes, Don believed the series would end, so he pursued other opportunities, eventually signing a deal with Universal Pictures. Then, Andy chose to keep the show going, without him. It marked a turning point neither man fully moved past. Don felt blindsided. He had been loyal and expected that in return. Though he exited gracefully in public, friends said he felt hurt and abandoned. Andy claimed there was no animosity, but others close to the show revealed frustrations. Some believed Andy saw Don's departure as betrayal. Others hinted at Andy's discomfort with sharing the spotlight. The two remained cordial, even appearing together occasionally in later years. But the warmth that once defined their bond had faded into something more formal. They were polite, respectful, but no longer close. After Don's passing, what reignited curiosity was what his family found among his personal belongings. In a locked drawer were letters, some addressed to Andy, others unsent. Some were apologetic, others read like unfinished conversations. Early Andy Griffith Show scripts were covered in Don's handwritten notes, underlined lines, and personal commentary that showed his deep attachment to that time in his life. One fragile envelope, dated just after he left the show, contained a short message. "I wish things had been clearer between us. I never wanted it to end this way." No one knows if that letter ever reached Andy, but what is certain is that Don carried that unresolved tension with him to the end. And as his family sorted through the pieces he left behind, it became clear. Some friendships are far more complicated than they appear, and what came to light about Don's final days would be even more unexpected, because the public version of events only told half the story. When news of Don Knotts' passing broke in February of 2006, the headlines were respectful and predictable. "Beloved comedian dies peacefully," they read. The public pictured a quiet farewell, surrounded by loved ones, filled with gratitude. But according to his daughter, Karen Knotts, that version of events left out much more than it revealed. Don's final days were complicated, and at times, even strange. He had long battled health issues. Macular degeneration stole much of his vision, and he had been diagnosed with lung cancer after years of smoking. Still, Don refused to slow down. Even in his late 70s, he continued performing, giving interviews, and writing. It was as if retirement, for Don, meant surrendering to the silence he had spent a lifetime avoiding. When he was hospitalized, family and close friends gathered. Karen described the mood as surreal. As Don drifted in and out of consciousness, some visitors made light-hearted jokes at his bedside, believing that laughter was what he would have wanted. Karen later said she had to leave the room to collect herself. Her father was barely holding on, yet the moment felt more like a performance than a goodbye. That was just the beginning. Among his final belongings was a folded list tucked in a drawer beside his bed. It contained names, some crossed out, others underlined. People he wanted to see, people he did not. Some names had question marks beside them. It was as if Don, even in his final hours, was still trying to untangle personal relationships left unresolved. Scattered nearby were scribbled notes, half-formed character ideas, one-liners, jokes. Don was not just keeping busy, he was trying to stay seen. His final wishes were unusual. No grand ceremony, no public speeches. He wanted to be remembered with laughter. More curiously, he left strict instructions about personal items in his home. Some drawers were to stay closed. Certain letters were to be destroyed. Karen admitted she read them anyway. What she found revealed a father far more layered than the man she grew up watching on television. Don was not clinging to fame. He was clinging to meaning, to being understood, not as a performer, but as a person full of contradiction, fear, brilliance, and regret. His final days were not defined by peace, but by a quiet emotional storm few recognized until it had passed. And what his family uncovered next, inside the room he had guarded most closely, would truly leave them speechless. Don Knotts' home was modest, quiet, traditional, and unassuming, much like the man himself. But tucked in the back was one room that even those closest to him rarely entered. It was his personal study, and after his passing, it became the most revealing part of the entire house. When his daughter Karen and a few family members began sorting through his belongings, most rooms held expected items, photos, awards, old scripts. But the study was different. Behind a locked wooden door, they found a room frozen in time. On the desk sat a vintage typewriter. Shelves were lined with books, tapes, and binders. And under the desk, a locked cabinet. Inside that cabinet were dozens of handwritten journals, neatly stacked, many tied with string. These were not scripts or comedy notes. They were raw entries filled with fears, reflections, and deep emotional struggles. Some pages were rushed and messy. Others were heartbreakingly clear. He wrote about feeling invisible, even in fame, about regrets he never voiced, missed chances, strained relationships, and an enduring fear of dying alone. There were reflections on family, on faith, and on whether he had truly left a meaningful mark. Among the writings were sketches, strange, deeply personal illustrations of characters no one had seen before. Some were goofy, others eerily dark. One sketchbook bore the title, "The Ones I Could Never Play." There were also letters, notes written to himself with words like, "You are enough," and "You deserve to rest." These were not dramatic, they were quiet reminders from a man trying to stay afloat. To the world, Don Knotts was the man who had it all. But in this room, he was just a man trying to hold on. Karen later said it felt like meeting her father for the first time. And what followed would take her even deeper, into memories, confessions, and truths that would forever reshape how she understood the man behind the laughter. Because now, it was not just about what Don left behind. It was about what his daughter would finally uncover. For most of her life, Karen Knotts saw her father through two lenses, the one the world adored and the quieter, more complex version she lived with. To the public, Don Knotts was a comic genius. To Karen, he was loving but emotionally guarded. And after his death, the deeper truth began to surface. Karen had always admired his work and even followed him into show business, but she admitted that her father was never easy to read. He cared for her deeply, but often kept a quiet distance she once chalked up to work or stress. That changed when she began reading his journals, letters, and notes. What started as grieving became something else entirely. The man she thought she knew was far more layered, strong, but deeply fragile. He had survived trauma, poverty, and anxiety, yet never allowed himself to fully enjoy his success. Fear of losing it all never left him. Among the discoveries were unsent letters to family. One expressed guilt for not being more emotionally present. Another thanked Karen for her patience and called her the only person who ever really saw me. That line, she said, changed how she viewed their entire relationship. Some reflections were painful. He wrote of moments he regretted, times he withdrew or failed to connect. But those writings helped Karen understand. His distance was not coldness. It was protection, a way to cope with emotional weight he never fully shared. Eventually, Karen turned what she learned into a memoir, Tied Up in Knots, and a stage tribute to her father. But she did not focus on his fame. She told the truth, the full, complicated story of a man who made millions laugh while quietly carrying his own sadness. What she found was not just memorabilia. It was a breadcrumb trail left by someone who may not have had the words to say what he felt, but clearly wanted to be understood. And when you take it all together, one thing becomes clear. The world never truly knew Don Knotts. But now, finally, we do. By the time Don Knotts passed away, he had become more than just an actor. He was a symbol of harmless, wholesome comedy. His face was etched into American culture. His roles were replayed for generations. To most people, that legacy was enough. But now, with everything we know, the childhood trauma, the handwritten confessions, the locked cabinet full of secrets, it is impossible to see Don the same way again. Because Don Knotts was not just the bumbling deputy or the eccentric landlord. He was a man who laughed not because life was easy, but because it was not. He used comedy as a lifeline, a defense, a survival tactic. Every shaky word and nervous glance on screen was rooted in real fear. Every character he created was a mask he wore with intention, sometimes to entertain, and sometimes just to hide. That is not a weakness. That is a kind of courage we rarely talk about. What his family found inside his home did not destroy his legacy. It deepened it. The journals, the letters, the drawings, they revealed a man who spent his life walking a tightrope between private pain and public joy. A man who was never able to fully silence the insecurities planted in his childhood. A man who achieved greatness not in spite of his inner turmoil, but because he channeled it into something people could hold on to. And maybe that is the most powerful truth of all. Don Knotts made people laugh when he could barely hold himself together. He carried fear like it was furniture, always there, always heavy, and still found the strength to go on stage, deliver a line, and make the world forget their own sadness, even if just for a moment. That is more than performance. That is grace. His daughter Karen once said that the greatest tribute to her father was not the awards or the reruns. It was the fact that people still smile when they hear his name. And now, those smiles mean even more, because they come with understanding. Behind that nervous laugh and those bug-eyed expressions was a soul who deserved to be known, not just as a comedian, but as a fighter. a survivor, a complicated, brilliant, wounded, and deeply human man. Don Knotts may have spent his life hiding parts of himself, but in the end, what was found in his home finally gave us the missing pieces. And what those pieces revealed was something truly unforgettable.